Soul. Hi guys. I've been playing The Sims a lot recently, so I thought maybe I should go back to my roots and get back to the classics. So today I'm actually going to go back to one of the Jane Austen stories that I think is probably the most popular Jane Austen book that exists. If you've ever talked to anyone about Jane Austen, they might not necessarily know who that is. Surprising, I know, but I've had this experience. But if you mention Pride and Prejudice, they'll go, oh, that. Even if they've never read or seen it, it's like in the cultural zeitgeist enough for them to have a concept of people in fancy dress and love interests and that sort of general vibe, the period piece, the BBC Britishness. Why exactly are people drawn to Pride and Prejudice specifically? Like, out of all of Austen's 7 novels, why that one specifically? Why not Mansfield Park or Sense and Sensibility or even Emma? What is it specifically about Pride and Prejudice that has garnered so much attention and so much love and like a fan base that has existed and is still going strong since it first was published, really? And why is it like even potentially stronger today? So I figured let's go over that and find out. Harold Bloom, a noted literary scholar and critic, stated, "Austen's humor, her mode of rhetorical irony, is not particularly Shakespearean, and yet her precision and accuracy of representation is. Like Shakespeare, she gives us figures, major and minor, utterly consistent, each in her or his own mode of speech and being, and utterly different from one another. Her heroines have firm selves, each molded with an individuality that continued to suggest Austen's reserve of power, her potential for creating an endless diversity." Now, this comparison to Austen and to Shakespeare or to Austen and to any other writer is a tradition that we can't help but compare. We compare authors, directors, basically anyone within the same field, even if Shakespeare and Austen were vastly far apart as far as time or even style and convention goes. I mean, Austen wasn't a playwright, for one thing. But there are some conventions that Austen did follow, as she couldn't help but be a bit in the tradition of Shakespeare in her own way as well. Like, for example, when we talk about tragedies and comedies as being the 2 basic genres of books, plays, anything, when we talk about comedies, the traditional idea of a comedy meant that the story would end in a marriage, whereas the tragedy would end in death. Basic. It didn't necessarily mean that a comedy was going to be hilarious, although that certainly made, the story more interesting. It meant it ended in marriage. A happy ending. In some of the other videos on this channel, we talk about the formula that you could expect in a modern romantic comedy. And Jane Austen, in her own way, follows that sort of pattern as well. Jennifer Cruz, on Jane Austen as the mother of the modern romance novel, stated that Jane Austen set the standard for the genre. She wrote woman-centered fiction set in an emotionally just universe. That is, her stories not only are about women, but also focus on women's lives and relationships with other women, not just on women's lives as they intersect with men's. She wrote what seemed to be pleasant romantic comedies, but underneath are these hugely subversive ideas, and much of the best romance fiction today does exactly the same thing. One of these subversive ideas that you could expect in a lot of Jane Austen's works, but especially in Pride and Prejudice, is a definite undertone about class and class clashing, basically, which you get from the very, very beginning of Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that anytime you go in to speak about Pride and Prejudice, you must make a sort of witty reference to the first lines of the novel, where Mrs. Bennet has come to tell her daughters that these young men have moved into town and that they are going to bring their fortune with them. But before we get into all of that, we're going to go over who the Bennets are and why that might matter to them. First, there's Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, a quiet, bookish man who plays favorites, and his silly wife, who's afraid for the futures of their daughters because they don't have a male heir, and they could all end up on the street. So silly. Then there's the oldest sisters. Lizzy and Jane are the eldest and best friends. Lizzy is spunky and witty and protective, and Jane is kind and sweet and always looking out for her family. Then there's the youngest. Kitty and Lydia are your typical teenagers. Gossipy, giggly, irresponsible, here for a good time, not a long time. Mary is the typical middle child, and a bit forgettable and ultimately resentful because of it. Without this potential future of having a son, which was incredibly important at this time, there really wasn't anything for this family but to hope for good matches for their daughters, and that's basically what Mrs. Bennet devotes her life to doing. And oftentimes this means in the movies and etc. that we see her as ridiculous because she is a busybody and she is ridiculous, but also maybe we can have a little bit of sympathy for her character as well. When they find out that someone or someones have purchased or at least rented out the estates at Netherfield nearby, they realize that some potential bachelors might have moved in that could save them from a life of future poverty. The first chance that they're going to get to meet these young guys is going to be at a party. And once it begins, it seems like everything's going well. Everybody's kind of wondering if these new guys are going to show up or not, and what that could mean, and, are they attached to other people? Is there going to be some drama? Are they attractive? Are they snobbish? What could we be expecting? And finally, they roll in. The new rich clique. We have Mr. Bingley and his, of course, best friend, the ineffable Mr. Darcy. Now, in your typical romantic comedy, this is where the meet-cute comes in. Luckily for us, we do get a bit of that in the representation of Jane and Bingley. A meet-cute is what you call the moment when two future lovers meet, a cute little moment that connects them forever. Like our old friend Billy Shakes, there are two pairs of lovers in this story too. Of course, that meet-cute doesn't exactly extend to Darcy and Lizzy when Bingley goes to his friend and offers, hey, why don't you go speak to Lizzy? Why don't you go speak to Jane's sister? I think, that could work out for you, or why don't you come join us? Darcy is evidently too good to join in on their fun and says something to the effect of, you've spent time with the only tolerable girl here. Unfortunately, Lizzy hears this, which makes this not a meet cute, but a meet ugly. Hate at first sight. After that first meeting, Jane is given an invitation to go have lunch with Bingley. Now, naturally, Jane is hoping that she can take the carriage or the car in order to go meet him because he doesn't exactly live close by. But naturally, Mrs. Bennet has other plans. Mrs. Bennet has the idea that if Jane looks pitiful enough and potentially has a cold or hurt feet or whatever the excuse is in this modern adaptation, they will feel so sorry for her that she will have to stay longer, thereby granting Jane the sympathy in their hearts and potentially future marriage. So Jane is ousted from the house and walks all the way there. Of course, at the first opportunity, Lizzy, upon finding out that her sister is potentially unwell at this stranger's house, decides that she has to go look out for her and find her and make sure everything's okay. And as her mother doesn't exactly seem to be worried about this, Lizzy goes after her to go see. Upon arriving at the house, not exactly looking fresh after having walked in the mud and in the warmth and just being kind of a little frazzled, she arrives and finds that, of course, Jane, who may not be doing so hot, is under the tender care and attentions of Bingley. On the other hand, Darcy is also there, because she can't seem to shake this guy. And when Darcy tries to make some sort of half-hearted gesture of friendship or discussion towards her, she doesn't exactly accept it. So Darcy kind of closes off and puts those walls up yet again. Darcy's internal voice, I don't know why she's so mad at me. All I did was say she wasn't as attractive as her sister. What's the problem? This dissatisfaction with Darcy leaves room for, of course, another love interest. So naturally, it's the perfect time for another gentleman to introduce himself to us. Another love interest, potentially just behind that door. Another person that Lizzy can open her heart to and find somebody who's maybe less snooty and interesting and attractive and... Oh, no, not that guy. No, that's okay. We don't have to... No. Okay, I guess we gotta talk about Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins is the Bennet's cousin. And I know that's already a weird beginning to this. But let's remember we're in the Regency period, okay? People married their cousins. I don't know what else to tell you. You read other Jane Austen novels, and people, like, the actual protagonists marry their cousins. It's what you did, alright? It was very popular. The degrees of separation between people, your dating pool was a little small. You know, we didn't have Tinder back then. Alright, moving on. Mr. Collins is this very dull, unfortunate man who has this patronage by the esteemed Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who has basically mentored and shaped this little fussy person to being the man that he is today, and had taken him under her wing and is like, I will give you these things, you will be this man with this money and this cottage and this parsonage, as long as you get married. So TikTok, get married now. So as this has never exactly been Mr. Collins' strong suit or interest, he's like, crap, I gotta get married. Oh yeah, I have cousins. That would be good. And so he decides to go to his cousin's house, and he does just that. Now, again, I can understand the big concern and the big blaring sirens and the, oh no, don't marry your cousin. But also, the reason why Mrs. Bennet specifically is not adverse to this is, hey, if one of our daughters marries this guy who is the only male heir within our immediate circle, who will probably inherit our house after Mr. Bennet dies, then maybe we'll get to stay in this house and we won't have to leave. Yikes. So, as weird and ridiculous as it is that it seems like Mrs. Bennet is pushing any of her daughters to marry him, it's really about maybe we can keep this house and not be poor. Fun times. First, Mr. Collins directs his attention towards Jane. The eldest makes sense, traditionally. You marry people off based on age. It's what you do. So Jane would be the first on the line. But, luckily for Jane, she already has a suitor, and a richer one than Mr. Collins at that. So Mrs. Bennet kind of directs the attention away from Jane. It's like, no, Lizzy. You want to go for Lizzy. She's totally free. So Mr. Collins kind of looks over and he's like, yeah, I could do that. All right, sure. We can marry. Why not? And so Mr. Collins turns his very indelicate attentions towards Elizabeth Bennet, and tries to follow her around and continues to propose to her multiple times because she continues to tell him no, and he continues to think, oh, no, I remember this. Women actually say no, but what they really mean is try harder, stupid. So this is a game that we're playing, and I know the game, so I'm gonna propose again, and then actually again, and maybe she still wants me to try again. You never know. So, as Mr. Collins has not been educated in consent and instead has been watching some interesting YouTube channels about how to pick up women, evidently, he ends up leaving empty-handed and doesn't exactly try for even the next one down the line, Mary, who arguably would have made the most sense. So, what were we talking about again? Oh yeah, other love interests, about Lizzy potentially opening her heart to someone else, and there being somebody who could be a foil for Mr. Darcy, potentially, and yeah, we find that in Wickham. Now, Wickham is a young soldier who enters their life, and who is basically the opposite of Darcy in many ways. Kind of like Bingley, who is this happy, sunshiny person, but instead, Wickham is charming and attentive, warm towards her sisters and to her, and wants to talk to them about all these sorts of things, and about ribbons and things that girls are interested in, and romance and whatever, and basically doesn't appear to be too good to hang out with them, unlike some people, you know. Unfortunately, this is around the time that they also run into Darcy yet again, and like previous encounters with Darcy, he is cold towards them, only this time it's even worse, as he says basically, I didn't know that you would associate yourself with such people, and appears to be speaking about Wickham, and they're like, are you serious? You have a beef with this guy too? Like, do you just hate everybody? What is your problem, dude? Whatever we believe about Darcy or about Wickham, we naturally are inclined to like Wickham more, as Darcy hasn't exactly done much to endear us to him quite yet. And upon Darcy leaving, Wickham is able to explain that he and Darcy had grown up together. Darcy's father had taken him in and had treated him like a son, and that unfortunately Darcy has been so jealous of this attention that he had become the favorite that he hates him now. So needless to say, things are complicated. Time goes on. Jane and Bingley appear to be moving towards marriage. Seems like things are going pretty well. And then abruptly, we find out that Bingley and friends have suddenly left the area and gone to Bath. No reason, no understanding why. There's no, set date on if they're gone forever, or if they went on vacation, or what. But basically, Bingley ghosts Jane, and we don't have any understanding why. She writes him a letter, she waits, nothing, and eventually it just seems like he just strung her along and left. It's pretty hard for her. Around this time, Lizzy finds herself at another event where Darcy is involved, and she overhears him saying something to the effect that really confirms to her what she might have suspected just based off of her few encounters with Darcy alone, that Darcy had helped Bingley leave and had basically suggested that he end things with Jane. This is not good news for anybody. We've just been given reason upon reason to dislike Darcy, and at this point, Lizzy's world is spiraling because she knows this guy has not only ruined relationship with this other guy she knows, Wickham, has insulted her family, has now apparently ruined a potential future marriage of her best friend and sister, Jane. But now she just has to get away from this, so she just leaves. And on her way out, Darcy comes back around and chases after her, more or less. And just kind of like with Mr. Collins, it's another situation where she just wants to get away, and a guy is suddenly there and is like, hey, so I know this is awkward, and actually, I don't really like your family, and, you know, things, in spite of how many times I've tried to forget about you because this is just so annoying. I find this irritating, but I like you. Do you want to get married? And she's like, are you serious right now? And he's like, yeah, I know, but you want to get married? And she's like, not if you were the last guy on earth, dude. You've ruined everything for me. And he's like, fine. And she's like, fine. And then they leave. And basically, Lizzy just is in shock and like, what the hell was this guy's problem? Why is he doing this to her? And what? But before she has a chance to fully leave the area and to be able to go see Jane and even to talk to Jane and comfort her and see what's going on, she gets a letter or a text from Darcy explaining his side of things, wherein he says that from his perspective, Jane was not visibly demonstrative of her affection for Bingley, and that he had suspected that the interest was really on Bingley's side, and that he was going to get his hopes up for nothing, and that it would be better for him to move on. And that also Wickham, yes, he had grown up with Darcy and had been taken in, but also he had spent all of his father's money as a teenager or young man, and when he wasn't given more money to go gamble it off again, had instead tried to elope with Darcy's younger sister, who is still a minor, who is 15 years old, in order to get more money off of him. So yeah, they're not exactly friends anymore. And left with this information, Lizzy is very conflicted and very unsure of how she feels about really anything. Another quote from Harold Bloom says that, I favor the judgment that Elizabeth and Darcy scarcely change, and learn rather that they complement each other's not wholly illegitimate pride. They come to see that their wills are naturally allied, since they have no differences upon the will. The will to what? Their will, Austen's, is neither the will to live nor the will to power. They wish to be esteemed precisely where they estimate value to be high, and neither can afford to make a fundamental error, which is both the anxiety and the comedy of the first proposal scene. As readers, we have learned already that Elizabeth is inferior to no one, whoever he is. The Bennets want their daughters to be married off, and Lizzy just can't stop getting proposed to by potential suitors, but in the worst possible situations or scenarios. At least for Lizzy, she is only going to marry somebody that she can at least stand, and that's a quality I hope we all still hold to this day. There has been a lot said about Elizabeth and Darcy's characters, like who is more proud or who is more prejudiced, and in fact they both exhibit those qualities towards and against one another. They are both incredibly proud and incredibly prejudiced in their own ways, and Elizabeth can't help but have this like initial bad first impression of Darcy from that party, and from that basically it can't help but color every encounter she has with him from there out, whereas Darcy is from this upper class sort of background, and he's come to this small town, he doesn't know anyone there, and his first impression of her is of this kind of big, silly family, not in his class, not in his interests, and so he's immediately prejudiced against her just based on a class difference, and this initial prejudice can't help but haunt their impressions of each other from most of the book or movie, whatever the adaptation would be. That being said, after the initial letter writing that we have, where Darcy tries to explain his reasoning behind what he's done so far and tells her that he will now leave her alone and won't bother her anymore, we get this kind of insight into his character that makes you kind of at least do a second look at who he is and maybe wonder if our first impression of him had been wrong. In the movies especially, we get a little bit more of this. I was reading another article that was discussing how, especially in the movies, especially the 90s onward, we get a lot more of the male side of things. We get a lot more of the hero's perspective of things because we want to know their own interiority and their feelings and sensitivity in order to have an interest in them instead of them being this mysterious, vague figures. And so, to an extent, we get some of that, at least through letter writing, though often in the movies we get it through a lot of intense, pensive shots of Darcy letter writing or looking, brooding at things, and we go, wow, he must be feeling a lot of feelings. Lizzy gets the opportunity to travel with her aunt and uncle and to kind of get her mind off of things, and so she takes that chance and gets to go see some more of the countryside than she's really seen before. And unfortunately, or fortunately for her, that includes them stopping at Pemberley, which she realizes is Darcy's home. Now, it seems kind of hilarious and silly that you could just visit someone else's estate without them being there and kind of get a tour around, but kind of like where the stars live, Hollywood Boulevard, this is their estate. But that's basically what happens, and she's really embarrassed, but her aunt and uncle are like, no, we gotta see the house, we're here. And so they take her with them, and as she goes around and looks at this massive, beautiful property at Pemberley, she can't help but see parts of Darcy in the architecture or in the home, and all of these conflicting thoughts she's had about him are still kind of storming and brooding up there, and she is realizing, that maybe there's some parts of him, maybe it's the house, that are more attractive than she had originally considered. Now, she's hoping that they leave before they run into Darcy, but that doesn't exactly happen, and it's really embarrassing, but they bump into him just as he's arriving, more or less, and they're trying to leave, and oops, awkward encounter. And in the movie especially, we get that, the Keira Knightley one, we get that moment of him helping her up into the carriage, and the, hands touching, and it's like, oh my god, they touched hands! And that's the stuff that period romance is made off of. That kind of intimacy and that slow burn that we love so much. And then there's this part where they're all spending time together, and that's when the letter or the news of Lydia comes in. Now, in case you forgot, Lydia is one of Lizzy's more mischievous teenage sisters, the kind that always is getting in trouble. And unfortunately, it has come to her attention that Lydia and Wickham have run away together. Now, at this time, this is even worse than if it had happened now. I say that it depends on the circumstance, clearly, but unfortunately for the time that it was written, the appearance of evil is as bad as the evil itself. So if it appears that Lydia has had any sort of relations with Wickham outside of marriage, her reputation is ruined, and that means that bad reputation will go on to the Bennet family, who is already struggling as it is. And this is just bad news anywhere you look. While Lizzy's getting this news and Darcy is there, and she tells him what happens and she's distraught, Darcy's suddenly like, I have some unrelated business I have to attend to, goodbye, and just leaves. And Lizzy's like, oh crap, what am I supposed to do? And basically begins the journey back home. Upon arriving home, however, she finds out that things don't look quite as bad as they had once had when she had first received the news. Her father had met Wickham down the line and had helped them get married to make sure that their reputation would be intact. Now, naturally, they don't have a lot of money, so Lizzy feels sympathy towards this, but also isn't fully aware of Darcy's relation to this until Mr. Bennet returns and is able to explain that Darcy had stepped in and had been the one to actually fund their marriage and give them some money to start off their life together. And now, more than ever, her impression of him is completely changed. And Mr. Bennet even can recognize this and is like, I thought you hated this guy. She's like, oh my gosh, my impression of him is so wrong, so different than it was once before. Now, around this time, Bingley comes back into town, and he and Darcy go to the house, and Bingley finally works up the courage to go talk to Jane and to apologize for ghosting her and for not believing that she was interested in him and for basically abandoning her attention, and promises that if she would accept him, that this time it would be for real. This time he's actually proposing to her, even though it's been months they've spoken. And Jane accepts, and things finally seem like they're going to turn out for the better. And that's when the crazy stuff happens. That night, right when everyone is asleep, things should be going about their normal, dreamy way, someone suddenly bangs at their door at like the middle of the night, and Lizzy finds out that somebody wants to speak to her specifically. And that person is Lady Catherine de Bourgh of Mr. Collins fame. Now, Lady Catherine, as it turns out, is Mr. Darcy's aunt. Remember that, like, degrees of separation thing I was talking about before? Yeah. During their sort of tour of the area, Lizzy had met with Mr. Collins again and had actually met Lady Catherine at a dinner, and even Lady Catherine's daughter, who supposedly was betrothed to Darcy apparently and was kind of sickly looking and all of these things. To see her again and to realize that she's come all this way to see her in the middle of the night, not during visiting hours, is very, very strange. And Lady Catherine comes in with just accusation after accusation of, I've heard that you're trying to marry Darcy. You're trying to do this. You're trying to be a homewrecker, a future homewrecker. I know this is what you're trying to do. And why are you trying to do this? And you don't even have the money or the this or the that. And Lizzy has to butt in and be like, that's not true. We're not engaged. We're not anything to each other. And Lady Catherine's like, oh yeah, like, then you better promise me that you'll never get engaged to him. Promise me that you'll never be attached to him. And Lizzy's like, I'm not gonna promise anything like that. I don't have to prove myself to you. I don't have to promise anything to you. I'm not gonna do that. And Lady Catherine, so offended, just storms out into the night. And that's the last they see of her. This is naturally disturbing in more ways than one, but also it actually kind of begins to hurt because, you know, Lizzy did have the chance to marry Darcy at one point, but that was a long time ago at this point, and it almost feels like a different lifetime away ago, in that the perspective she had of Darcy was so different back then that she never would have married him. The way that she sees him now, yeah, she'd be interested in him, but he had already said in his letter that he was never going to bother her about this sort of thing again, and that, like, now marriage was completely off the table now that she's finally interested in him. But of course, this is a rom-com, romantic comedy, romance novel, story, etc. So, upon the darkest moment before the dawn does arise, and we do get that famous scene of them walking towards one another where Lizzy is going on a regular walk and we see Darcy coming back, approaching her home, and they meet in the middle, and Darcy begins to try to explain his part and to explain that he heard about what had happened with Lady Catherine even, and that he knows that he's already asked her before, and and that he doesn't want to bother her, and if she tells him no, then he's not going to bother her ever again, but he still wants to ask her one more time, and this time Lizzy wants it, and so this time Lizzy says yes, and we finally get that happy ending for her as well. So, yeah, so that's the basic bare bones Pride and Prejudice. Amazing, obviously, iconic, sure. Story that we've now kind of hold up other stories to, like as a model for a good romance and a good romantic comedy. As Carol Shields says in her work on Jane Austen, the extraordinary contemporary interest in Jane Austen's novels and in films based on the novels is thought by some to reflect our society's exhaustion with the human body and conversely a new awareness of the sensual power of delayed gratification. There's not really a lot of description about appearances or about like physical relationships, but it's really about feelings and this delayed like ongoing journey of will they, won't they. Like Jane basically helped pioneer a huge amount of will they, won't they stories that we have to this day. So the slow burn, like we can thank a lot of that to her. Whereas Jennifer Cruz states, finally Austen's happy endings are earned. They're not all cream and roses. She writes not of impossibly happy endings, but of probable endings, which the heroine has earned by growing, learning, compromising, and ultimately being true to her own sense of self. Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice, for example, does get the fairy tale ending, but she doesn't get it by being stunningly beautiful or having the right shoe size or sleeping until someone wakes her up. She struggles and grows and earns her happiness. That's a romance novel ending. In Clashes and Compromises in Pride and Prejudice by Laura G. Mooneyham, she states, the secret of Pride and Prejudice's popularity lies in the dynamics between its hero and its heroine. The spark of their relationship depends on their equality of intelligence and perception, for Elizabeth and Darcy are more fully equal in this sense than any other of Austen's protagonists. Each is both protagonist and antagonist. That is, their struggle is as much against each other as it is against the pressures of society or family. The novel presents the balance of power not only between two characters, but two conflicting modes of judgment, and by extension, two conflicting systems of language. That delayed gratification and that balance of two incredibly strong personalities and two vastly different backgrounds, those qualities are things that we really appreciate and can really keep our interest when reading or watching a movie. In movies and miniseries and television, we get these expressions and these long shots of longing and these sort of like hints of feeling like based on expression and face and action that we don't necessarily get when we're reading, but in the reading and there's still that ongoing like draw and knowledge, especially if you know it's Pride and Prejudice, you know there's going to be a happy ending, but it feels like as you're reading, you're like, it's just not here. Where is it? When is it coming? How is this going to even happen? And that like draw can make you keep reading or keep watching, knowing that this is supposed to be a romantic comedy. Like this oost, this unresolved sexual tension or unresolved romantic tension, how is that going to be resolved? Is it going to be resolved? I'm really frustrated right now. And eventually, when it is resolved, it's finally satisfying. Whether you believe that they've changed or not, they've at least opened their perceptions of one another and are willing to admit when they're too proud or too prejudiced, that maybe they're a better match for one another. Maybe they're the only match for one another. Who could stand them? And that's why we love them so much. Whether you like the Colin Firth version, Bridget Jones, or whether you're the Keira Knightley stan all the way, or whether you want to go watch them fight some zombies, or like literally there are just so many adaptions out there, and even so many modern movies beyond Bridget Jones that have been inspired by Pride and Prejudice, and so many good books out there that have been inspired by the series, and pretty much whatever fandom you're in, you can count on there being a Pride and Prejudice alternate universe fic, at least one related to your OTP. So regardless of whether or not Pride and Prejudice is your favorite Austen novel, or even if you like Jane Austen, you can at least thank her for inspiring a whole lot of fluff and stuff that we can enjoy to this day. So whether you love Valentine's Day or think it's just a holiday to sell Hallmark cards, it's still a great time to watch your favorite adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, or even crack open a book again. I also wanted to give a big shout out to everybody who agreed to be in my video this time. Before, I've done this pretty much entirely alone, aside from some extra side help, but I've had a lot of help this time. I had some friends and family who were willing to do this thing with me, and I just wanted to thank them. So thank you for being in it with me. I'd also be amiss if I didn't mention the fact that Sophie, my guinea pig, who played the part of Kitty, one of the Bennet sisters, has passed away. I was gonna just do an in memoriam thing, but I feel like it would feel like a joke, and I wouldn't blame you for laughing because it would seem like a funny, like, in memoriam. The guinea pig, you'd be like, haha, very funny. No. We filmed on Sunday, and she got suddenly very sick on Tuesday and died on Wednesday. I'm a little bit laughing. I was very sad. I'm still sad that she's gone. Yeah, shout out to the real one, you know? Sophie, I miss you. Yeah, so this is dedicated to all the guinea pig Pride and Prejudice fans out there. And thanks, Sophie. So happy Valentine's Day, everybody. Hope you find your Darcy, Elizabeth, Bingley, Jane, whomsoever you love. I hope it works out for us all. Let me know if you have any other ideas of something you would like me to cover in the future. I have some other thoughts, but this is something I've been wanting to do, and I'm really happy I got people to do it with me, and I hope you enjoyed it. Alright, happy Valentine's Day, and happy reading.